你在里面，你如果想要吃丰富的话，就是吃的很多样东西的话，两个人呐，2个人估计最少应该到300块，最少300块吧，要丰富哦。不是说什么我今天吃粗饱，就是只吃1、2样这样子就结束了那种，那当然没问题。但是如果你要吃饱一点的话，那可能都要花个300、400，贵的。不干，这塔怎么射到我了？干！哦，位置没抓，哭啊！刘备来补一发可以，这样没那么亏了。撇开价格不谈，现在夜市很多东西自式化。对啊，就是说真的，就是没有真的完全没特色，就是跟你讲一样，就是没特色。你高雄的夜市、台中夜市、台南夜市，到北部的夜市，各种夜市，基本上卖的东西87、8项。牛排对吧？标配，鱼蛋对吧？牛排、鱼蛋，然后现在什么玉米粒，然后骰子牛，然后卤味，然后关东煮、大肠包小肠之类的，就是你看的东西都是大概都是那样子，完全没有比如说台北应该有的特色，或是台中应该有的特色，或是高雄应该有的特色，完全没有，就是北中南全台湾的东西都一模一样。不要说一模一样，87、8项，就没有任何一个地方有自己的都比如这东西只有比如说只有高雄才有的东西这样子，完全没有。你不管在哪里都会吃到类似的东西。没接到，抱歉。没有追到的啦。没射死。鸡卷、鸡排、葱油饼、Q 地瓜球，对啊，都一样的、啊，不管去哪里都是一样的东西。Of course, a sound plan for honor. Of course, justice is come for honor. Of course, certainly. Of course, for honor. Of course. 那个吗？这本尊呢？哇哦 ！Of course, the light is my strength. For honor, a sound plan. 庆忌有特色呀。现在台中庆忌不是特色了啦，其他地方也都跟上，好不好？那已经不是台中独有的特色了。Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For my father, the king. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Ooh, is there danger? Of course. For honor. Of course. For Lord For honor. Certainly. 哎呦 Of course. 他5级啦，靠背，吓死我！ For honor. 好想刚刚有点想要冲动，想要推刘备进去。没有目标可以推啊，想，刚刚想推他。青年夜市的动员，其他地方很动员，什么动员？青年夜市有什么特色的吗？我不知道哎。真假本尊哦，这很难分呐。你可以从后期，就是前期看不出来，但后期装技能点满之后啊，分身的血会比本尊多。你等到他等级起来之后啊，等到他有等级之后，分身的血量会比本尊多，其他地方是分不出来的。
Sound plan. I stand for the light. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. For honor. Of course, for honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
我靠，这样就是
a sound plan. Of course. For honor.
完了啊！不该皮啊！不该皮嘞！妈的！无血捕鱼大哥。
I'm here to help. For honor. Certainly. Justice shall be done.
Our allied town is under siege.
Of course.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Is there danger? For honor. Certainly. Of course.
You are past redemption.
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. I stand for the light. A sound plan.
那洗兵压不住，这边把 CP 刷一刷了。
Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan.
现在这样做
Certainly. For honor. Of course.
Our forces are under attack.
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Justice. Of course. Certainly. Of course. For Lord Iran. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
Our forces are under attack.
Certainly. A sound plan. Of course.
Betrayal of light.
Certainly.
冲冲冲！出血斧吗？看看吧，
Of course.
看一下。
The light is my strength.
只有个张辽哎，我不太想出血斧，
Certainly.
应该出魂枪先吧。
Is under siege.
魂枪感觉就够砍了。
Of course. For honor.
Our allies'
哎，
hero
你就
has
别挡路。
A sound plan. For my father.
Allies' hero has fallen.
For Lord Iran.
Feel my wrath.
For honor. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For my father. For honor. Foul name. Certainly. For honor. Sound plan. Certainly. I stand for the light. I'm here to help. Of course. A sound
哎呦，这闪电球差点电
shall
死
be。done. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Is there danger? Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course. The light is my strength. For honor. A
他
sound
没有
plan.
冲吗？怪怪的。
Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor.
我是本尊。哦，哇，
Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan.
再赚一波兵，我们去魂枪。
For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. I stand for the light. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. The light is my strength. This better. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound. For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
好球！
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
咦，
Of course. Certainly. A sound plan.
还以为他放松戒心，偷偷来干坏事。
For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor.
Allies' hero has
Of course.
fallen.
Certainly. Of course. Certainly.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
A sound. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. For Lord honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For my father.
我可以打说，
I'm here to help.
那马他会死
A。sound plan for honor. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For Lord Iran. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Allies'
course.
hero has fallen.
For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. Of course.
但是还是挺难
A
考。
sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Feel my wrath. For my father the king. Of course. A sound plan.
You are past redemption.
For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. For Lord Iran. Of course. A sound plan.
Betrayer of the light.
For honor. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor.
Our
Certainly.
allies' hero has
Of course.
fallen.
A sound plan. Foul knave. Certainly.
You are past redemption.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. Of course.
Our allies' town
Certain.
is under siege.
A sound plan. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Of course. Certainly. Is there danger? I stand for the light.
轮枪喽，
Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. The light is my strength. A sound plan. Is there danger? For honor. A sound plan. Of course. Certainly.
The restless dead
A sound
await.
plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Certainly. The light is my strength. Stand for the light.
Our allies' hero has fallen.
哎呦，
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly.
Our allies'
A
town
sound
is under
plan.
siege.
Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. For my father.
You are past redemption. Our allies' town is under siege.
I stand. I'm here to help. Of course. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. Certainly, justice shall be done. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Is there danger? Certainly.
Our allies' town is under siege.
Certainly. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor.
Betrayer of the light.
Of course. Certainly. The light is my strength.
赚的有点爽。
Of course. A sound plan. For honor. For order. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. I stand for the light.
Our allies' town is under siege.
Of course. A sound plan. Is there danger?
Inventory is full.
A sound plan. I'm here to help. Of course. For honor. Certainly. A sound. For honor. A sound. Of course.
Justice is come.
Certainly. Of course. For honor.
跟昨天的法克一样。
For honor.
Where shall I
A
find the
sound
spirit?
plan. Certainly. For honor.
Feel my wrath.
A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly.
Betrayer of the light.
哎，这本就是什么？真假？
Feel my wrath. For my father, the king.
Of course.
Our allies'
Certainly.
town is under
A
siege.
sound plan. For honor.
啊，可以直接擦掉，拆掉吧。
For honor. Of course. Certainly.
神驹跟昨天的法克有点类似。
Justice has come. You are past redemption.
For honor. A sound plan.
他是真的要跳了。
Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Certainly. Of
现在
course.
跟不一样。
Of course. A sound plan. Certainly. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Justice shall be done. A sound plan. For my father, the king. Of course. For Irish only to a sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. A sound.
Our allies' town is under siege.
For Lord Arise.
Justice is come. You are past redemption.
你知道吗？他跟法兰克应该是不同类型的，他应该是越被骂越会继续玩下去。
For honor. A sound plan.
Our allies' town is
For
under
honor.
siege.
Certainly. For honor.
崩溃了。
Sound plan. All allies under siege. Of course. Betrayer of the light.
长角其实也很软，长角已经完全玩到自己没有装备了。
All allies towns under siege. Of course. Betrayer of the light.
少一个人，少一个人。
I'm here to help. All allies towns under siege. Lord around. A sound plan. All allies hero has fallen. Certainly. A sound plan.
搞不动。
Certainly. Of course. Certainly. All allied towns under siege. Foul. Yes. A sound plan. Of course. Betrayer of the light. A sound plan. All allied towns under siege. Of course. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. All allies hero has fallen.
该怎么办？
A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Certainly. For honor. All allies hero has fallen. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. A sound
其实不
plan.
知道人在哪里。
For honor. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor.
靠！我在你家啊！
For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. I stand for the light.
刚跑到异世界去了。
Certainly. A sound plan. Certainly. Of course. For honor. Is there danger? Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. For honor. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. Of course. Foul name. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. Certainly. I'm here to help. I stand for the light. A sound plan. Of course. Betrayer of the light. I'm here to help. A
啊，
sound
这是固定的
plan.
bug 哦。
For honor. Certainly. For honor. Of course. A sound plan. For honor. Certainly. Our allies' hero has fallen. For honor. For my father, the king. Certainly. For honor. A sound plan. For honor. A
我买不
sound
装啊。
plan. You are past redemption. Certainly. For honor. The light is my strength. Certainly. Of course. A sound plan. I'm here to help. Is there danger? Of course. I stand for the light.
打死人就会脱离团战区，
For honor.
有点方便是不是？
For honor. The light is my strength.
来了，
Of course. For honor. I stand for the light. Certainly. A sound plan.
英来喽，走吧。
For honor. Of course. The light is my strength. For honor. A sound plan. Of course. For honor. Of course. For honor. Of course.
Allies,
A sound plan.
Betrayer of the light.
I'm here to help.
Justice.
For honor.
You are past redemption.
Certainly. I stand for the light. For honor. Certainly. It's for honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For honor.
Betrayer of the light. Justice.
他有点硬，
Betrayer of the light.
要跑出来。
Sound plan.
Search required.
A sound plan. Of course. Certainly. Of course.
Feel my wrath.
Certainly. For honor. Certainly. A sound plan. For honor. Is there danger? I stand for the light. Of course. For honor. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Is there danger? Certainly. For honor. Certainly.
Allies, give
For
us
honor.
full.
Of course. Of course. Certainly. For honor. Of course. For my father.
Mm. 这场刘备实在太爽了，一直抓一直抓，都不怕死。